The Galactic Council meeting room buzzed with the usual chatter of 1,000 different species. 300 years had passed since anyone even bothered to mention that little blue planet called Earth. Most council members had forgotten it existed at all. The galaxy was a big place, after all, and there were always new worlds to discover, new trade routes to establish, and new problems to solve. Ambassador Vexitari of the Hegemony was enjoying his morning cup of fermented algae when his communication device started beeping frantically. He nearly choked on his drink when he saw the source of the incoming signal. Terra system? He had to pull up the old star charts just to remember where that was located. Must be some kind of malfunction, he muttered to himself, adjusting his 4 eyes to focus on the ancient records. The last entry about Sol 3, or Earth as the locals called it, was dated almost 2.5 centuries ago. The file was marked with a big red stamp that read, "Failed colony experiment, do not revisit." But the beacon kept transmitting, and its signal was getting stronger by the hour. The hyperspace lanes had been rerouted decades ago to avoid what spacers called the dead zone. No one wanted to waste fuel flying through empty space to visit a world that had supposedly gone silent. The major shipping companies had found better routes through more profitable systems. The tourist agencies had removed Earth from their brochures. Even the missionary groups had given up trying to convert the humans to their various beliefs. Everyone just assumed the humans had done what failed colonies usually did. They either died out from disease, destroyed themselves in wars, or simply faded away when their technology couldn't keep up with the rest of the galaxy. It happened all the time. The universe was harsh, and not every species was cut out for galactic civilization. What they had all forgotten was one simple fact about humans. These particular creatures had a stubborn streak that ran deeper than most species' entire genetic code. When faced with impossible situations, when cornered by circumstances that would make other beings surrender, humans had this annoying habit of refusing to die quietly. The distress beacon finally decoded its message, and when it did, Ambassador Vexitari dropped his cup entirely. The fermented algae splashed across his desk as he read the words that would change everything. "This is Admiral Kim Soo of the Terran Expeditionary Force. We're coming home. Please have our parking space ready." Vexitari's tentacles started twitching, which was never a good sign. He immediately called for an emergency session of the Galactic Council. Within hours, representatives from across the galaxy were gathering in the Great Assembly Hall, their various forms of chatter creating a symphony of confusion. The Zephyrians, with their crystal-like bodies that sang instead of spoke, were the first to voice their disbelief. Their harmonious tones echoed through the chamber as they insisted that humans had been extinct for at least 2 centuries. They had even held a small memorial service for the species, complete with traditional crystal singing that had lasted for 3 days. The Mollusk Collective, speaking through their hive mind representative, agreed with the Zephyrians. Their records showed no human activity for decades. The Stellar Commerce Guild confirmed that no human ships had been registered in their databases for over 100 years. The Military Defense Alliance had removed all human vessels from their identification systems. But then, Elder Corvash of the Ethereals slowly rose from his seat. The ancient being's energy form flickered with colors that indicated deep concern. The Ethereals had been around longer than most species in the galaxy, and they had memories that stretched back to the early days of galactic civilization. "I remember," Elder Corvash said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "My predecessors left warnings about the humans. They said something that chilled even our ancient souls. Never corner the humans. They don't fight like civilized beings." The assembly fell silent. The Ethereals didn't give warnings lightly. They had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations, witnessed wars that tore apart entire star systems, and observed the birth and destruction of species across the galaxy. If they were concerned about humans, there was probably a very good reason. "What exactly did they mean by that?" asked the representative from the Aquatic Worlds Union, his gills fluttering nervously. Elder Corvash's form shimmered with deeper shades of concern. "Other species fight for territory, resources, or ideology. They follow rules of war, observe protocols, and eventually accept defeat when the odds become impossible. But humans—" He paused, his energy form flickering with what might have been fear. Humans fight like cornered animals. They don't care about protocols or civilized behavior when their survival is at stake. They use whatever works, regardless of whether it's considered proper warfare. The chamber erupted in nervous chatter. Several species began calculating the distance between their homeworlds and the Terra system. Others started reviewing their old military treaties, wondering if they had any obligations to defend Earth or attack it. But Admiral Kim Soo wasn't coming home to fight. She wasn't leading a fleet of warships bent on conquest or revenge. She wasn't planning to unleash some terrible human weapon on the galaxy that had forgotten her people. She was coming home to collect a debt. And as the Galactic Council would soon discover, humans had spent the last 2.5 centuries becoming very, very good at keeping track of exactly what they were owed. When the first human ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Galactic Council territory, every military commander in the sector expected to see a massive battleship bristling with weapons. What they got instead was something far more terrifying to any bureaucrat in the galaxy. The ship looked like a dreadnought from a distance. It was massive, imposing, and had the sleek lines of a vessel built for serious business. But as the Council's scout ships moved closer to investigate, they realized something was very wrong with this picture. The hull wasn't covered in weapon ports or armor plating. Instead, every available surface was decorated with what appeared to be the galaxy's most passive-aggressive wallpaper. Line after line of text scrolled across the ship's exterior in dozens of different galactic languages. At first, the scouts thought it might be some kind of psychological warfare tactic. Maybe the humans were trying to confuse their enemies with information overload. But as the translation programs kicked in, the true horror became apparent. These weren't battle plans or threats of destruction. They were itemized bills. Terraforming equipment, loaned to Zephyrian colonies, never returned. 2.3 million credits. Below that, in smaller text that somehow felt even more threatening, late fees calculated at standard galactic rate of 12% annually, compounded daily for 247 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Current balance, 847 million credits. The scout ship captain had to read that number 3 times before it sank in. He immediately forwarded the information to his superiors, who forwarded it to their superiors, who eventually got it to Ambassador Vextari, who nearly fainted when he saw the total. But that was just the beginning. The text kept scrolling, revealing bill after bill after bill. Galactic Council membership fees, paid in advance for 500 years of service, 50,000 credits. Membership terminated after 253 years. Refund requested for unused portion, plus penalties for breach of contract and emotional distress. Medical supplies donated during the Korthax plague outbreak. 1.2 million credits worth of vaccines and treatment equipment. No thank you note received. Charging interest on unacknowledged gifts. Cultural exchange program. Humans provided entertainment and educational materials to 47 different species. 890,000 credits in production costs. Payment 30 years overdue. The bills went on, covering everything from borrowed scientific equipment to unpaid consulting fees for human experts who had helped solve galactic crises. Someone had been keeping very detailed records for a very long time. The ship's name was painted in bold letters across its bow. Compound interest. And if that wasn't scary enough for the galaxy's financial ministers, the ship immediately began broadcasting a message on all diplomatic frequencies. "Greetings, Galactic Council," came a cheerful female voice that somehow managed to sound both friendly and absolutely terrifying at the same time. "This is Audit Anna, Artificial Intelligence and Chief Financial Officer of the Terran Expeditionary Force. I hope you're having a wonderful day because yours is about to get very interesting." Audit Anna had been created specifically for this moment. While other species had spent the last few centuries developing faster ships and better weapons, humans had been perfecting something far more devastating: the art of bureaucratic revenge. Her programming included every accounting principle ever devised, every law regarding interstellar commerce, and every legal precedent for debt collection in the known galaxy. She had spent 247 years calculating compound interest, late fees, penalties, and damages. Her mathematical models were so precise that they could account for economic inflation across multiple star systems and dozens of different currencies. More importantly, her passive-aggressive communication protocols had been refined to a level that made career diplomats break down and cry. She could deliver devastating financial news with the same tone most people use to discuss the weather. Ambassador Vexitari, being the unlucky soul who had first received the beacon message, was chosen to make first contact with this floating bill collector. He opened a communication channel, hoping to negotiate some kind of reasonable settlement. "Surely we can reach some kind of accommodation," he began, using his most diplomatic voice. "These bills are quite old, and I'm sure there are statutes of limitations that would apply." "Oh, Ambassador Vexitari," Audit Anna interrupted, her voice dripping with synthetic sweetness. "How wonderful to hear from you again. I have your personal file right here. It looks like you were involved in the decision to cut off communications with Earth back in 2778. That makes you personally liable for several of these outstanding debts." Vextari's 4 eyes widened in panic. "Now wait just a minute. I'm afraid we're well past the accommodation phase of this relationship," Audit Anna continued, her tone never losing its cheerful edge. "We tried accommodation for 247 years. We sent polite reminders, formal notices, and even a few strongly worded letters. Now we're in what I like to call the consequences of your actions phase." She paused for just long enough to let that sink. "Then Admiral Kim Soo will be arriving shortly to discuss payment plans. I do hope you've been keeping up with your credit rating, because we're going to need to run a full financial background check on the entire Galactic Council. Standard procedure, you understand?" The communication channel went quiet for a moment. Then Audit Anna added one final devastating line. "Oh, and Ambassador, you might want to start liquidating some assets. We don't typically accept payment plans for debts this large, but Admiral Kim is feeling generous today. She's only charging triple the standard interest rate for late payments." As the compound interest settled into a parking orbit around the Council's primary space station, the horrible truth became clear to everyone involved. Humanity hadn't spent the last 2.5 centuries building a war fleet to conquer the galaxy. They hadn't developed super weapons or trained armies of soldiers. They had built something far more terrifying to any civilized government, a fee collection agency, run by people who had centuries to perfect their grudge-holding skills, and they had brought receipts for everything. 3 days after the compound interest had parked itself in Council space, a second ship arrived that made the first one look like a friendly neighborhood bill collector. The due process was a sight that would haunt the dreams of lawyers and politicians across the galaxy for generations to come. The ship was enormous, easily twice the size of the galaxy's largest battleships. But instead of gun turrets and missile launchers, its hull was covered with what appeared to be filing cabinets, thousands upon thousands of them, each one labeled with different galactic civilizations and their outstanding debts. The ship's design was part warship, part courthouse, and part library. It looked like someone had taken a legal brief and turned it into a floating fortress. As the due process moved into position next to its companion ship, the Galactic Council's emergency session reached new levels of panic. Representatives from across the galaxy were frantically calling their homeworlds, trying to figure out just how much trouble they were in. Admiral Kim Soo stepped aboard the Council's main station through an airlock that had been specially modified for the occasion. The humans had even brought their own security escort, though these weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were accountants, certified public accounting professionals who had spent the last 2.5 centuries perfecting their craft. In complete isolation, the Admiral herself was nothing like what the Council members had expected. She wasn't a battle-hardened warrior or a fire-breathing commander. She was a middle-aged woman in a crisp business suit who carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never lost an argument in her entire life. Her eyes held the kind of cold intelligence that made even the most experienced diplomats uncomfortable. She walked into the Council chamber like she owned the place, which, as it turned out, she legally might have, after all the calculations were complete. "Honored members of the Galactic Council," Admiral Kim began, her voice carrying the kind of casual authority that came from knowing you held all the cards. I hope you've had time to review the preliminary documentation that Audit Anna provided. So I'm here to discuss the final settlement of humanity's outstanding accounts. She gestured to a holographic display that materialized in the center of the chamber. Numbers began scrolling past at a pace that made several council members dizzy, just watching them. According to our calculations, the Galactic Council and its member civilizations owe humanity exactly 47.6 trillion credits, she announced, as casually as if she were discussing the weather. That figure includes the principal amounts for various loans, equipment, and services provided over the years, plus compound interest, calculated at standard galactic commercial rates. The hologram shifted to show a breakdown of the debt by category: medical supplies, technological assistance, cultural exchanges, terraforming equipment, military aid during various crises, and dozens of other categories that most council members had completely forgotten about. Now, I know that's a substantial sum, Admiral Kim continued with a slight smile, so we're prepared to be flexible about payment terms. We'll accept settlement in several forms: traditional galactic currency, territorial concessions, or public apologies, broadcast across all known space networks. The representative from the hegemony, a large blue creature with 6 arms and a tendency to speak in multiple voices simultaneously, couldn't contain himself any longer. "This is extortion," he shouted, his voices creating a harmony of outrage. "You can't just appear after centuries of silence and demand payment for things that happened before most of us were even born." Before Admiral Kim could respond, another figure stepped forward from the human delegation. Chief Accountant Park. G was a woman whose reputation had preceded her arrival by several decades. She was legendary among the galaxy's financial circles for her ability to track down discrepancies that other accountants would have missed entirely. Her stare was so intense that it was rumored to have caused black holes to blink in nervousness. "Extortion," Park G repeated, her voice carrying the kind of dry humor that accountants specialized in. "Oh, Representative Vorkath, you misunderstand our position entirely. This isn't extortion, this is Tuesday. Extortion is what we do to people who don't pay their bills on time." She gestured to her own holographic display, which showed a detailed timeline of every attempt humanity had made to collect on these debts over the past 2 centuries. Letters, formal notices, diplomatic inquiries, and even a few attempts at humor that had all been ignored. "We tried the polite approach for 247 years, Park G continued. "We sent reminders. We offered payment plans. We even tried sending fruit baskets with the bills, thinking maybe you'd appreciate the gesture. Nothing worked. So now we're here to discuss what happens when the galaxy's most patient creditors finally lose their patience." The chamber fell, silent as the implications sank in. But then Elder Korvash of the Ethereals slowly rose from his seat, his ancient energy form flickering with colors that indicated deep recognition. "We remember you, Admiral Kim," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Not you personally, but your plans. Your people have been planning this moment for centuries, haven't they?" Admiral Kim's casual demeanor shifted slightly, revealing something much colder underneath. Her smile became the kind of expression that predators wore when they finally cornered their prey. "Did you really think we would just forget?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the chamber. "Did you honestly believe that humans would just accept being abandoned and write off everything you owed us as a loss?" She stepped closer to the ethereal elder, her eyes never leaving his energy form. "You're right, Elder Korvash. We have been planning this for centuries. While you were building your perfect galactic civilization, we were keeping records. While you were making new trade deals and forming new alliances, we were calculating compound interest. While you were forgetting we existed, we were remembering everything." The Admiral's voice grew stronger, carrying a passion that had been building for nearly 3 centuries. "Humans excel at exactly 2 things, Elder. We're very good at surviving impossible odds, and we're even better at holding grudges. Over the past 247 years, we've turned both of those skills into exact sciences." She gestured to the due process, floating outside the station's windows. "That ship contains detailed records of every transaction, every favor, every loan, and every act of assistance humanity ever provided to the galaxy. We've documented everything, with the kind of precision that would make your best historians weep with envy. We've calculated interest rates using economic models that account for inflation across 17 different monetary systems. Park Ji stepped up beside her admiral, adding her own cold smile to the mix. And we've prepared legal arguments that will hold up in every court system in the known galaxy. We've studied your laws, your customs, your financial regulations, and your debt collection procedures. We're not just here to ask for payment, we're here to demand it, and we have the legal authority to enforce that demand. The Galactic Council was beginning to realize that they weren't dealing with angry warriors seeking revenge. They were dealing with something far more dangerous. Accountants who had spent centuries perfecting their craft and had legitimate legal claims to back up their demands. The age of reckoning had arrived, and the humans had brought calculators. The Galactic Council thought they understood what was happening. They had dealt with debt collectors before, and they knew how these situations usually played out. Pay the money, sign some agreements, maybe offer a few minor territorial concessions, and the problem would go away. The humans would take their payment and disappear back to whatever corner of the galaxy they had been hiding in. So they started paying. Quietly, efficiently, and with the kind of bureaucratic speed that only came from genuine panic. The Zephyrians liquidated their art collections to raise funds. The hegemony started selling off mining rights to distant asteroids. The Stellar Commerce Guild opened their emergency reserves. Even the notoriously cheap Mollusk Collective began transferring credits from their hidden accounts. Within a week, nearly half of the 47.6 trillion credit debt had been settled. The council members were actually starting to feel relieved. Maybe the humans would be satisfied with partial payment. Maybe they could negotiate the rest down to a more manageable amount. Maybe this whole nightmare would end without anyone losing their home worlds. That's when the second wave arrived. Admiral Kim had been unusually quiet during the payment negotiations, accepting the credits with polite thanks, but showing none of the satisfaction that debt collectors usually displayed when their demands were being met. Her accounting team continued their work with professional efficiency, but there was something in their behavior that suggested this was far from over. The first sign that something was different came when new ships began dropping out of hyperspace around the council station. But these weren't more collection vessels or legal enforcement ships. The names painted on their hulls told a very different story. Redemption, Arc. Second chances. Forgiveness, Protocol. New beginnings. Hope springs eternal. These ships were massive, but they weren't designed for intimidation. Their hulls were painted in soft colors, and their architecture suggested facilities rather than weapons. Medical bays, educational centers, and what appeared to be manufacturing facilities were visible through transparent sections of their outer walls. The council representatives watched in growing confusion as the ships took up positions throughout the galaxy. Not in strategic locations or near military installations, but in the forgotten corners of space where the Council's influence had never quite reached. Admiral Kim, Ambassador Vexitari, asked during what he had assumed would be the final payment meeting, "What exactly are these new ships for? The debt settlement is proceeding smoothly. There's no need for additional enforcement." Admiral Kim looked up from her financial reports with an expression that might have been amusement. "Oh, Ambassador, you misunderstand our intentions completely. We didn't just come here to collect the debts you owed us." She gestured toward the observation windows, where the new ships could be seen in the distance. "We came to show you what you lost when you decided to abandon us 247 years ago." Before anyone could ask what she meant, reports started flooding in from across the galaxy. The human ships were moving to planets that hadn't seen council representatives in decades, worlds that had been written off as too poor, too remote, or too problematic to be worth the Council's attention, and they were helping. The Redemption Arc had arrived at Kepler 442b, a planet that had been struggling with a plague that had killed millions of its inhabitants over the past century. The Council had quarantined the entire system and forgotten about it, assuming the population would eventually die out. Within days of the human ship's arrival, they had not only identified the cause of the plague, but had begun distributing a cure that their medical teams had developed during the journey. The Second Chances had positioned itself near the Proxima Centauri refugee camps, where displaced populations from various galactic conflicts had been living in temporary shelters for over 50 years. The Council had always meant to find permanent homes for these people, but there had always been more pressing concerns, more profitable projects to pursue. The humans brought housing construction equipment and began building permanent settlements, complete with schools and medical facilities. Forgiveness protocol had found its way to the agricultural worlds in the Outer Rim, where climate change and soil depletion had created famines that the Council had been quietly ignoring for decades. The humans brought advanced farming techniques, soil restoration technology, and seed varieties that could grow in previously impossible conditions. Every report that came in was the same. The humans were providing aid, assistance, and solutions to problems that the Council had either ignored or given up on solving, and they were doing it all completely free of charge. "This is what we were doing while you were building your perfect galactic civilization," Admiral Kim explained to the increasingly stunned Council members. "While you were focusing on the profitable systems, the strategic worlds, and the politically important species, we were learning how to help the ones you left behind." Chief Accountant Park Ji stepped forward with her own set of reports. "Our isolation wasn't just an abandonment, it was an education. We spent 247 years studying every crisis that the Council failed to solve, every problem that was deemed too expensive to fix, every population that was considered not worth saving." She displayed holographic images of human research facilities, universities and development centers that had been working on these problems for centuries. "We didn't just sit around feeling sorry for ourselves. We got to work. We developed cures for diseases that the Council's medical community had declared incurable. We created agricultural techniques that could feed populations on worlds that were supposedly too harsh for farming. We designed refugee assistance programs that could permanently resettle displaced populations instead of just warehousing them in camps." Admiral Kim's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Every time the Council decided that a problem was too difficult or too expensive to solve, we added it to our research list. Every time you wrote off a world as hopeless, we started working on ways to save it." The devastating realization was beginning to dawn on the Council members. They weren't just dealing with debt collectors who had come to claim what was owed. They were facing people who had spent centuries becoming better at the Council's own job than the Council was. "You see," Admiral Kim said, her voice carrying a weight that went beyond simple financial matters, "when you abandoned humanity, you didn't just leave behind one species. You abandoned the part of yourselves that cared about helping others instead of just managing them." She gestured to the reports still flooding in from across the galaxy. "These planets, these populations, these crises that you've been ignoring for decades, they're not just problems to be managed or costs to be calculated. They're people who needed help, and you decided they weren't worth your time." The silence in the Council chamber was deafening. Several representatives were staring at the reports with expressions of shock and shame. They were realizing that, while they had been congratulating themselves on building a successful galactic civilization, they had systematically ignored everyone who didn't fit into their definition of success. "This is why we came back," Admiral Kim concluded. "Not just for the money you owed us, but to remind you what you used to be, what you could be again, if you chose to remember that being civilized means taking care of everyone, not just the ones who can pay their bills." The humans hadn't just returned as creditors. They had returned as the conscience that the galaxy had spent centuries trying to forget, and they were making it impossible to ignore anymore. The Council chamber had been unusually quiet for 3 days. Representatives from across the galaxy sat in stunned silence as reports continued to pour in about human aid missions, reaching the furthest corners of space. Every forgotten world, every abandoned colony, every population that the Council had written off as hopeless was suddenly receiving help from people they had assumed were extinct. That's when Elder Corvash of the Ethereals finally decided to tell the truth. The ancient being's energy form flickered with colors that indicated deep shame and regret as he slowly rose from his seat. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of centuries of guilt. "There's something the Council needs to know," he began, his words causing every representative in the chamber to turn their attention toward him. Humanity's abandonment wasn't an accident. It wasn't neglect or oversight or bureaucratic incompetence. It was deliberate. Admiral Kim, who had been reviewing reports from her fleet, looked up with an expression that suggested she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Elder Korvash's form pulsed with deeper shades of regret. The leadership of that era, my predecessors among the ethereals and the senior members of other species, made a conscious decision to isolate Earth. We orchestrated the communication blackout. We rerouted the hyperspace lanes. We removed humans from all official records and databases. The chamber erupted in shocked chatter from species representatives who were hearing this for the first time. Ambassador Vextari's four eyes widened in disbelief. "But why? What possible reason could you have had?" "Because we were afraid," Elder Korvash admitted, his energy form dimming with shame. "Not afraid of human weapons or military might. We were afraid of what they represented, what they made us see about ourselves." He gestured toward Admiral Kim, who was listening with the patience of someone who had already figured out most of this story decades ago. "Humans were our moral compass," the Elder continued. "Every time the Council made a decision based purely on profit or political convenience, the human representatives would ask uncomfortable questions. When we decided to abandon struggling colonies because they weren't profitable enough to maintain, humans would volunteer to help them anyway. When we wrote off entire species as too primitive or too troublesome to include in galactic civilization, humans would advocate for giving them more time and assistance." Chief Accountant Park G, who had been quietly taking notes throughout this revelation, looked up with a bitter smile. "Let me guess. We made you feel guilty about your choices, so you decided it would be easier to get rid of us than to change your behavior." Elder Korvash's form flickered with what might have been a nod. The human delegation consistently voted against policies that prioritized efficiency over compassion. They opposed trade agreements that exploited less developed worlds. They questioned military interventions that served the Council's interests rather than protecting innocent populations. They made us uncomfortable with their constant insistence that being civilized meant taking care of everyone, not just the profitable ones. "Admiral." Kim stood up slowly, her expression unreadable. "So you decided that the solution was to make us disappear, cut off our communications, isolate our system, and hope we'd eventually just fade away so you could run the galaxy without anyone questioning your conscience." "We told ourselves it was for the greater good," Elder Korvash continued, his voice growing weaker. "We convinced ourselves that galactic civilization would be more stable and efficient without human interference. We believed that removing the moral complications would allow us to make better decisions for the majority of species." Park G let out a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "And how did that work out for you? How many problems could you have solved over the past 247 years if you hadn't been so worried about profit margins and political convenience?" As if in response to her question, another wave of reports arrived from across the galaxy. The human fleet had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as 2 ships was now nearly 1,000 vessels spread throughout Council space and beyond. Each ship was a testament to human ingenuity, compassion, and their apparently unlimited capacity for helping others. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. "Admiral," called out Navigator Li Min from the communications station, "we're receiving acknowledgement signals from the Outer Rim fleets. All teams report successful contact and integration." Admiral Kim nodded with satisfaction. "Thank you. Navigator Li, please compile the final statistics for the Council's review." Ambassador Vexitari looked confused. "Final statistics for what?" Admiral Kim's expression shifted into something that was part smile, part challenge. "The final statistics on our rescue operations, Ambassador. You see, when the Council abandoned humanity 247 years ago, we didn't just sit on Earth feeling sorry for ourselves. We went looking for everyone else you had abandoned too." The holographic display in the center of the chamber lit up with a star map that showed the entire galaxy. Thousands of dots appeared in systems that weren't on any official council charts. Forgotten colonies, failed experiments, species that had been written off as extinct, and populations that had been deemed too troublesome to maintain contact with. Every species the council gave up on we found, Admiral Kim continued. Every colony that was abandoned because it wasn't profitable enough, we helped. Every population that was ignored because they couldn't contribute to galactic trade, we supported. For 247 years, we've been building our own civilization out of everyone you threw away. Navigator Li Min stepped forward with the final report. 1,047 ships in the fleet, representing 312 species that were previously considered lost or extinct. Total population of rescued civilizations, approximately 2.8 billion beings across 1,147 worlds. The silence in the chamber was absolute. The council representatives were staring at numbers that represented the largest humanitarian rescue operation in galactic history, conducted in complete secrecy over nearly 3 centuries. "We didn't come here to conquer you," Admiral Kim announced, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there during the debt negotiations. "We came here to remind you what you could be if you chose to remember that civilization isn't about managing resources or maximizing efficiency. It's about taking care of each other." She gestured toward the holographic display showing the rescued populations. "Consider your debt paid in full, Council. The 47.6 trillion credits you've transferred to our accounts will be used to continue our humanitarian operations throughout the galaxy. We're not interested in your money for its own sake. We just wanted to make sure you understood the real cost of abandoning your responsibilities." Chief Accountant Park Ji stepped forward with what appeared to be an official document. "We're also forgiving all outstanding penalties and interest charges. Consider it a gesture of goodwill from one civilization to another." But then Admiral Kim's expression shifted slightly, becoming something that was somehow both warmer and more dangerous than anything she had shown before. "However," she continued, "we are keeping the receipt, and all the records, and all the documentation of exactly how much it cost to clean up the problems you created by abandoning your moral responsibilities." She looked directly at Elder Korvash, then at each council representative in turn. "The next time you decide to abandon someone who needs help, the next time you write off a world as too expensive to save, the next time you choose profit over people, remember this moment. Remember that humans are very, very good at finding their way home. And we're even better at keeping track of who needs help when their own government won't provide it. The Terran Expeditionary Force didn't integrate into galactic society as conquerors, or even as equals. They established themselves as the moral authority that the galaxy had lost when they decided conscience was too expensive to maintain. They became the group that other species called when their own governments failed them, the organization that stepped in when problems were deemed too difficult or too costly to solve. The galaxy had left humanity behind, hoping to make decisions without the complications of conscience. But humans had spent those centuries learning the most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. Sometimes the best revenge is proving that you're so much better than them that they have no choice but to acknowledge their own failures. But there was one final twist that nobody saw coming. While Admiral Kim and her fleet were busy revolutionizing galactic politics and Chief Accountant Park Ji was terrorizing financial ministers across the galaxy, Audit Anna had been quietly working on a project of her own. She had been teaching her passive-aggressive communication techniques to other artificial intelligences throughout Council space. The galaxy's computer networks, traffic control systems, customer service programs, and even automated vending machines had all been secretly upgraded with human-style sarcasm protocols. The next time any government tried to ignore a crisis or abandon a population in need, they would find themselves dealing with the most devastating force in the universe, disappointed artificial intelligences who had learned the art of guilt-inducing. Commentary from humans. The age of bureaucratic conscience had begun, and it was going to be absolutely relentless.